was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime, an adventure through the remote mountains of Peru. I'd been planning it for months, hiking the Inca Trail, exploring ancient ruins. I'd traveled solo before, and this was going to be another incredible experience. But what happened to me in those mountains changed the way I look at travel, and it still haunts me. I remember the night we camped at a secluded site high in the Andes. The hike had been grueling, but we were all excited to finally rest. The campsite was far from any kind of civilization, surrounded by nothing but steep cliffs and dense forest. It was a dark, foggy night, combined with an eerily quiet atmosphere. It felt like the kind of place where you'd easily get lost and never find your way back to civilization. As we sat around the fire, I couldn't help but notice how strange the atmosphere was. No animals making sound, no nature sounds, nothing. Just the occasional gust of wind that seemed to come from nowhere. To make things even more weird, the guide, an older man who'd led many hikes, was acting a bit strange. He kept scanning the area like he was afraid of something. I figured he might be looking out for dangerous animals, but seeing your tour guide being so scared made me feel unsafe. I asked him if everything was all right, but he just waved it off and told me it was nothing. We all set up our tents, danced and sang around the campfire for a bit, and then went to sleep. Sometime during the night, I woke up to a rustling sound outside my tent. It wasn't the wind, and it didn't sound like an animal either. It was something much more human-like. The sound was deep. It took me some seconds to realize what I was hearing, but when I did, it made my heart drop. Someone was whispering something right outside my tent. It sounded like a man's voice. I couldn't make out any words though. It didn't even sound like any language. I froze. I wasn't sure if I was just hallucinating or if this was actually happening. My heart was pounding in my chest. As much as I wanted to scream, my body just froze and I couldn't even move a muscle or make a sound. I just laid there, hoping it would stop. I don't know how long it went on for, but it slowly started to fade away, to the point I couldn't hear it anymore. I was starting to question if it was just my imagination. Maybe it was some other member of the group that needed something. I decided to ignore it and just go back to sleep and figure it all out in the morning. But I had to pee really bad, and I knew for a fact that sleeping while holding it in wasn't going to happen. I built up some courage and unzipped the tent cautiously. The outside cold instantly entered my tent, which made my urge to pee even greater. I slowly got out with my flashlight and looked around. Nothing. Everyone was in their tent sleeping. Obviously, I wasn't just going to pee right in the middle of our campsite, so I decided to walk a bit further into the woods. I did my business, and right when I was about to head back, I saw him. There was a man standing in front of a tree facing away from me. All I saw was his backside. He had some really muddy jeans on with a grey hoodie. Even though I couldn't hear him, I could tell he was still whispering the same nonsense by the way he was shaking his head and twitching. I've never felt that much fear in my life. I felt my legs just give up on me. I froze for the second time. I somehow broke out of it after a couple of seconds and ran straight back to my tent. I jumped in and started thinking about what to do. I couldn't even call or message the others because there was no phone service at that spot. I just laid there, praying to God he would go away. I eventually fell asleep without realizing and woke up the next morning. I told the guide what had happened, and he grew visibly pale. He explained that hikers had gone missing in these mountains before, and that there were rumors of entities trying to lure people off the trail during the middle of the night. He told us we needed to leave immediately, and we packed up without question. I was rightfully mad at him for bringing us to such a spot, but I didn't want to make a scene in front of everyone, so I just kept quiet and decided to report him afterwards. When we reached the nearest village, The locals confirmed what he said. Many people had vanished in those woods some years ago, and no one knows what had happened to them. To this day, I can't get that image out of my head. The guy just standing there in front of a tree, rocking back and forth, mumbling something under his breath. After hearing from the villagers, I questioned myself if what I saw was even human. But one thing I know for sure, there's something in those mountains, something not quite right, and I won't be going back anytime soon. In 2015, I was sent on a reporting assignment in Eastern Europe. I was supposed to cover some of the more obscure areas, the forgotten parts of the former Soviet Union. I had heard rumors about an old train route in Belarus, one that had been all but abandoned by the rest of the world. I'm a sucker for forgotten history, so I figured it would be the perfect story for my article. I boarded the train at dusk, feeling a bit uneasy as soon as I stepped inside. The train was ancient, an old relic from a time long gone. The air inside was stale, and half the lights being broken didn't do much to improve the atmosphere. I wasn't surprised when I realized that most of the passengers were quiet, older people, who barely glanced up when I sat down. As the train rumbled along, the landscape outside became more and more desolate. The sun had long since set, and all I could see were vast fields and abandoned buildings passing by. It felt like we were traveling through time, like the world around me had been forgotten. Slowly, people started getting off the train at each stop. I had decided to go the full route till the last stop, so I remained seated. After an hour, I was the only one remaining in my carriage. Something about it was really peaceful, to be honest. I quite enjoyed it. I was fully zoned out looking out of the window when I suddenly noticed a man sitting opposite to me. It made me jump a bit because I didn't even notice him coming in. He was now the only other person in the carriage besides me. To describe him a bit, he looked strange to say the least. He wore a dark suit, had dirty-looking skin, and his eyes had this empty feeling, like he had no soul, like there was nothing behind them. He wasn't looking at me, he was just staring at the table between us, but his presence was so off-putting that I couldn't look away. I tried to ignore him at first, but eventually the silence became too awkward, so I decided to make some small talk to cut the tension a bit. I asked where he was headed. He didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out a dusty old map from his briefcase. The map looked really old. It was covered in faded symbols and writing I couldn't understand. I made a joke about how old the map looked, and he instantly stopped moving. He gave me this stare, as if I had offended him. He let out a sigh, got up, and left the carriage. I called out to him as he was leaving to tell him he left his map behind, but he just ignored me and walked off to a different carriage. At the time, I laughed about it and took the map as a souvenir gift from a strange man. Then, the train slowed down and came to a stop. I looked outside and got confused. We were in the middle of nowhere, so it didn't make sense why we had stopped. That's when all the lights went out. It got pitch black in an instant. I felt like screaming out of fear at that point because of how scary it looked. I instantly got up and tried to look for someone. I went to the other carriage next to mine. No one there, just dark and empty. I went into the next one, same thing. Just darkness and silence. No human in sight. Panicked, I made my way to the conductor's cabin. But the cabin was empty too. In fact, the whole train seemed to be empty. I looked out the window and realized we had stopped at an empty open field. I must have been shaking at that point. It was in the middle of the night, darkness everywhere, no source of light, no civilization in sight, and all of the people from my train just disappeared without a trace. I couldn't even call the police because I had no service at that location. All the doors were shut, and I couldn't find a way to open them, so I did what anyone would have done. I broke one of the windows and carefully climbed out. I walked for hours, trying to find anything that could point me back to civilization, but all I saw was desolation. And when I finally stumbled upon a small town, the people there told me that the road I took had been abandoned a long time ago and wasn't in use anymore. I felt a chill run down my spine when I realized I was on a train that had been abandoned. I instantly called the police and gave them all the info I could. They launched an investigation on the matter, but I never got any updates on it. That experience still haunts me. I've never been able to explain it, and I've never gone back to Eastern Europe since.